We are starting on our sixth and final square of our cube design today. We're going to use Model Magic to create two contrasting three-dimensional textures on our square. You're going to create two different implied textures on the surface of your square, and we're going to paint this with acrylic paint in a complementary color scheme to do that. So we're going to break this down. We're starting with the contrasting three-dimensional textures. So to do that, we're going to use something called Model Magic. This is a air dry modeling clay that you can easily manipulate, and then you basically just let it air dry. So this stuff is kind of a unique texture. It kind of like breaks apart, but also can be squished and kind of formed into whatever texture you might need. So first, I would probably start thinking about where do you want this three-dimensional form that you have on your project. I think I'm going to do this line and this line, and then maybe I'll do all the lines. I'm not positive yet, but for sure I want these two. So before you start here, I'm gonna have you play around with this Model Magic and just see some different textures that you can make. So like I can start by rolling this out into a snake. You know, this is a pretty smooth texture. I could pinch this and make kind of a spiky texture. Okay, so I can pinch this. You can see here, it's kind of like little peaks. You could squish it up and make it look like crumpled paper. You could also use like a pair of scissors to cut into here to kind of bring spikes up a little bit. Okay, so you can experiment with this a little bit today. To practice different textures, you could poke into it and make it bumpy. Okay, so lots of options here. I want you to play around a little bit with the Model Magic first. Once you figure out what kind of texture you want to use, you're going to go ahead and start forming your, using your design to kind of form that shape or that form. So I'm going to roll this out kind of like a snake. I'm going to place this here, and I'm going to use my pencil lines as a guide. And then I'm actually going to cut this here. And I think I'm going to get you guys some like plastic knives to cut here. For now, I'm going to use an X-Acto knife. Because that's what I have close by. But for you guys, I think I'm going to get some plastic knives. I don't necessarily want you guys using the X-Acto knives right now, but we'll see. Okay, one way or another, I'll get a knife for you guys to use. So there's my first one. And then I can just begin rolling out the second one. I want this to be as smooth as I can. This is going to be a smooth section on my design. So I'm actually gonna just push it down a little bit. Okay, I'm gonna use my knife to cut it down. All right, so there we go. There is my first two shapes. I think I'm gonna leave these smooth, and then I'm gonna add some aggressive texture to the next area of dough. So I think what I'll do is, I think I'll do these shapes here. And I don't want to make them stick out too far. So I'm just gonna kind of roll this dough, this Model Magic out. And then I think I'm just gonna end up kind of squishing them into place. actually think it might make sense for me to roll this out a little differently. So I want the thin end over here, and then it gets thicker, and then thin again down here. And like I said, I'm just gonna kind of like push that down to make the shape it needs to. This is really easy to mold. It is a little bit difficult for you to get like really specific textures. This isn't going to be as easy to model as like clay, for example. Clay is going to be a lot easier for you to manipulate. Okay, I'm going to cut off the extra. And you're not going to attach this to your artwork at all quite yet. We're going to actually let this air dry clay dry before we glue it down and paint it, because we will be painting this with acrylic paint, and we're going to want our Model Magic to be dry before we before we paint it. All right, so here's my next shape. I'm gonna kind of push it down. Cut off my excess. And you will be able to trim these up a little bit more if needed once they're dry. We're still gonna be able to cut them with the X-Acto knife if we need to. Okay, so I'm just gonna put those in place. Okay, now I need to figure out what kind of texture I want this to be. So I actually think what I'm going to do is use the pencil to make the kind of dotted texture pattern. So I'm just gonna kind of make this dotted pattern, a dotted bumpy pattern all over my Model Magic, but only on these big sections, because remember, I'm looking for you to create contrast here. So I want it to be different. I want two distinctly different textures. And I want you to think outside the box, be creative and unique. Don't do this specific texture just because I'm doing it. You are more than welcome to come up with your own unique textures. Like I said, you can push things into it. You can mold it a specific way. You could take something with a texture on it and roll it over the design. And your forms on here, your Model Magic forms, do not need to be as flat as mine either. If you wanted it to be more three-dimensional and you wanted it to stick out of the design more, you certainly could, okay? You could roll or form shapes, forms to put on here. That's totally fine. You can see where my Model Magic touched some of my paint or colored pencil here. That's totally okay because we're gonna be painting this once our Model Magic is dry. So your task for the first part of class is to take some Model Magic, practice some different forms, and then you can begin rolling them out onto your design. When you are waiting for these to dry, I would like you to put your entire projects over on the drying rack so they can dry without the pieces falling off, okay? Either that I'll have paper plates for you. It kind of depends on your project, okay? So I'll give you further instructions on how to put these away at the end of class. We are painting square number 6 of our cube with a complementary color scheme, and we are painting with acrylic paint. So I have a color wheel here so I can show you my complementary color scheme. This is important. It's important that you're able to recognize what is a complementary color scheme. So I wanted to stick with my theme of purple. So I chose violet as my first color. And a complementary color scheme is a color scheme that uses two colors directly across from each other on the color wheel. So my complement is going to be yellow. So I've got a violet, and my complement is going to be yellow. So I'm using violet and yellow. You can see here I have some paint on my paper plate. I actually probably got too much paint. You can probably take a little bit less than this. You don't need a lot to finish this. The area that we're painting in is not very large. I also grabbed a couple paintbrushes, some paper towel, and a cup of water. And then I also have some masking tape. If you're concerned about getting paint in a square where it does not belong, you can put some masking tape down on the edges of your design. If you do this, however, I want you to kind of push this down very lightly. The masking tape, if you rub it down too hard, it can sometimes tear up whatever's on the square next to it. So be very careful if you decide to go this route. I also would not put masking tape on top of your magazine collage section. So, you're welcome to do this if you'd like. It's certainly not required. But if you do, make sure you press down real lightly. I'm not going to worry about these sides because they're going to be glued onto the back of these other sections when we construct our cube, so I'm not going to worry about that. So I have glued down my Model Magic with my white Elmer's glue, and now I'm ready to paint with my complementary color scheme. So when I'm painting, I'm going to try to create two contrasting implied textures here. So implied textures. Acrylic paint dries relatively fast. It dries, in my opinion, it dries faster than watercolor, but obviously it also a lot faster than oil paint as well. But you do still have a little bit of time to kind of work with it. I like to work light to dark because it allows me to kind of go over light areas that I'm not happy with. So I'm actually going to start with my light areas first. I'm going to take an eraser and erase some of my lines because I'm using yellow paint, and yellow paint is kind of see-through. So I'm taking my eraser and I'm just gonna lighten up some of these lines. I still wanna be able to see them a little bit, but I don't want them so obvious so that if I have yellow paint kind of butting up to that area, I'm not gonna see the lines through it. All right, so I think I'm gonna start with yellow, and I think I'm gonna paint both of these sections yellow. So I'm gonna start with that. And you'll see me kind of build up layers as I paint here. So I'm just gonna start painting, and I will speed this section up so you can just watch me get some of this done. All right, while those shapes are drying, I'm gonna work in some of these spaces, I think. I'm gonna make these two spaces purple, violet, and I'm gonna work with my implied texture. So physical or literal texture is happening here, where it is literally like you can touch this and feel that it's bumpy. Implied texture is where you give the illusion of the way of something feels. So I'm gonna try to make this look textured in this spot. So that's what you'll see me doing. I'm gonna use a little bit of white to make that happen. So my goal here was to create kind of a soft, feathery texture that appeared like it might be fuzzy. I think feathery is a good word for it. Now I'm going to kind of continue to paint in the rest of this negative space. So remember, my color scheme is complementary, so I'm using yellow and purple as my base colors. I can also use the tints and shades of those two colors. So the tints are where you add white, like these. The shades are where you'd add black. I'm gonna encourage you that if you use this method, if you do work with tints and shades, you're using the black and white paint cautiously. Remember that you are gonna add only a tiny little bit of black at a time, especially because you are working with such a small space and with such a little amount of paint. You do not need a lot of black at all. Also, you might see that you might see me add some black to my yellow to create a shade. Remember that, well, I guess not remember, but if you've ever been curious why yellow starts to look green when you add black, it's because black oftentimes has a blue undertone, and blue plus yellow makes green. So that's what you might see happen if I decide to use the shade of yellow. I am gonna work on creating a contrasting implied texture in these spaces, and I think I might actually do them here in these little lines to make it look like rounded, I guess, or at least I'm gonna try my best. So that's what you'll see me work on next. All right, these two, I tried to give the illusion of it being smooth. I think I still have some work to do, so you may see me redo this, but in the meantime, I'm gonna work in the rest of this space to kind of fill in using my purple and yellow color scheme. All right, so now you can see I've painted two different implied textures, so a smooth texture and a bumpy texture. I've separated and painted all of my white space. You don't necessarily have to, but for this one, I'm gonna kind of suggest that you do. I'm very carefully peeling off the tape to make sure that I didn't miss any spots. And then I'm pretty much done with this square. This one is gonna dry on the drying rack. Acrylic takes a little bit to dry. It doesn't dry super fast, but not super slow either. And you can see from what I have left over on my plate that I definitely took too much paint. So when you guys need paint, make sure you only take a couple drops. I have way too much for the amount of space that I actually needed to paint today. So just kind of keep that in mind when you guys get paint. You are responsible for making sure that your paint cup, your water cup, paint brushes, and paint tray are all cleaned up at the end of the hour. Paint cups and paint brushes should not be left in the sink at the end of the hour. You absolutely need to clean them up.